10 months ago, a research vessel dragged a 9-mile string of microphones across the ocean off Vancouver Island and took the first pictures anyone has ever seen of a subduction zone tearing itself apart. 2 active tears, a 75-kilometre fracture, one section of the descending plate sitting 5 kilometres lower than the rock beside it, and then, at 11:41 on Sunday night, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck inside that exact zone. The good news is that the mechanism tells us this was almost certainly not the Cascadia Megathrust. The uncomfortable news is what it does tell us, and why one specific thing over the next few days will decide whether this was nothing at all. Quick note before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's break this down. Part 1. The alarm at 11:41. At 11:41 on Sunday night Pacific time, a phone alarm went off along the coast of British Columbia. Not a text message, not a notification. The specific, ugly, unmistakable tone of an earthquake alert app configured by someone who lives close enough to the Cascadia subduction zone to want warning. 208 kilometres southwest of Port McNeill, on the northern end of Vancouver Island, the seafloor had just moved. Magnitude 5.6, roughly 10 kilometres below the ocean floor, and within about 90 seconds, seismic waves were rolling east across the Strait of Georgia toward a metropolitan area of nearly 3 million people. Here is what makes tonight different from every other moderate earthquake that has rattled the Pacific Northwest this year. It is not the size. A 5.6 is a real earthquake, but it is not a rare one. It is not the shaking which woke people up and broke nothing. It is not even the fact that it was felt more than 450 kilometres away in Metro Vancouver, which is a long reach for an event this size and which we will come back to. It is where it happened. This earthquake struck inside the single, most structurally complicated segment of the Cascadia subduction zone. And I mean that in a very specific, very recent sense. Less than a year ago, a team of scientists published seismic images of that exact region, showing something nobody had ever directly observed anywhere on Earth before. The northern end of the Cascadia fault system is coming apart, not metaphorically, not on some abstract geological timescale that means nothing to anyone. There is a tear in the descending plate, roughly 75 kilometres long, and along one section of it the slab has dropped about 5 kilometres relative to the rock beside it. That is the ground that just moved, so I want to give you the answer to the frightening question right now, up front, before we go anywhere else. Because I think you deserve it, and because the rest of this is going to make a lot more sense once you have it. This was almost certainly not the Cascadia Megathrust beginning to rupture. We know that with reasonable confidence, and we know it within hours, and I'm going to show you exactly how, because the reasoning is genuinely elegant, and once you understand it, you will never look at an earthquake report the same way again. The evidence comes from something called a moment tensor solution. Seismologists draw it as a little sphere shaded in black and white, and everyone in the field calls it a beach ball, because that is what it looks like. The beach ball for this earthquake tells us the orientation of the fault that broke and the direction the rock moved, and what it says is that the rock moved sideways, on a fault that is nearly vertical. A Cascadia Megathrust earthquake would look nothing like that. Nothing at all. We will get into the physics properly, but the short version is that a megathrust rupture happens on a shallowly sloping surface, and it shoves one plate up and over another, and it lifts the seafloor, and that vertical lift of the seafloor is what generates a tsunami. Sideways motion on a near-vertical crack does not lift the ocean, which is precisely why Earthquakes Canada was able to state, with confidence, within minutes, that there was no tsunami risk. So take a breath. That part is real, and it is good news, and it is not spin. But here is the thing that has kept me up writing this instead of sleeping, and it is the reason the title of this video says what it says. Knowing that this was not the Megathrust does not tell us that this was nothing. Those are two completely different claims, and the space between them is where the entire story lives. Because this earthquake happened inside a plate that is actively being torn into pieces, in the segment of Cascadia that scientists have only just finished remapping, and in a place where our model of how the ground behaves is being rewritten right now, this year, by data exactly like tonight's. That is the thread I want you to hold on to for the next couple of hours. The mechanism says this was not the big one. The location says we should pay attention anyway. Both of those things are true at the same time, and anyone telling you only one of them is selling you something. Let me give you the numbers properly. The origin time was 6:41 and 30 seconds, Universal Coordinated Time on Monday, July 20th, 2026. On the west coast of North America, that was 11:41 at night on Sunday the 19th. Magnitude 5.6. The United States Geological Survey placed the epicenter 208 kilometers, or 129 miles southwest of Port McNeill, at a preliminary depth of 10 kilometers, which is 6.2 miles. Earthquakes Canada, the Canadian federal agency, placed it 219 kilometers southwest of Port Hardy, on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, also at roughly 10 kilometers beneath the ocean floor. Those two descriptions sound different. They are not. They are the same earthquake described using two different reference towns, by two agencies running independent solutions with different station networks. A spread of a few kilometers between agency locations on an offshore event is completely normal, and if anything, the agreement here is tighter than usual. A reviewed moment tensor solution put the source slightly farther down, at about 11.5 kilometers, or 7.1 miles. That works out to somewhere around 37,700 feet beneath the seafloor. I want to flag the honest uncertainty there rather than hide it, because it matters later. The preliminary depth was 10. The reviewed solution said 11.5. Offshore depths are genuinely hard to constrain because all your seismometers are on one side of the event, sitting on land, and none of them are on the ocean floor above it. So the truthful statement is that this happened roughly 10 to 11.5 kilometers below the seabed, and if that number shifts by a kilometer over the next week, nobody has lied to you. That is just what refinement looks like. No damage was reported, no injuries, no fatalities, no tsunami warning, no advisory, no watch from any agency in either country. What people did report was shaking across northern Vancouver Island, which is closest, through Campbell River, about 300 kilometers away, through Port Alberni, about 330 kilometers away, and then, remarkably, all the way into Metro Vancouver, more than 450 kilometers to the southeast, and across the border into parts of western Washington, including the Seattle area. Sit with that for a second because it is genuinely a little unusual. A magnitude 5.6 is a moderate earthquake. Close to the epicenter, it will knock things off shelves. Under normal circumstances, at 450 kilometers, you would expect it to be below the threshold most people notice at all, and yet felt reports came in from a metro area most of the way to the American border. There is a reasonable explanation, and it is not sinister. Seismic waves travel efficiently through cold, dense rock, and they lose energy quickly in warm, fractured or sediment-filled rock. The oceanic crust off Vancouver Island, and the slab of it that has already descended beneath the continent, is cold and dense and old. It is very good at carrying energy a long way with very little loss. So a moderate earthquake in that setting reaches farther than the same earthquake would in, say, the crumbling crust of a continental rift. But I do not want to wave that away entirely either, because it tells you something structural. The energy from this event propagated efficiently through the very slab that the new research says is fragmenting. The waves went through the broken thing, and how a rupture's energy moves through a fractured plate is not a trivial question. It is, in fact, close to the center of what scientists are now arguing about regarding how a future megathrust rupture would behave in this exact segment. So the reach is a small clue, and I am filing it rather than dismissing it. Now, the question you're actually asking. The one I asked at 11:42 at night, sitting up in the dark with my phone screaming at me. Was this a foreshock? I am going to answer that honestly with real numbers later on, and the answer is more interesting than either a flat yes or a flat no. But I want to plant something now, because it changes how you hear everything else in this video. The word foreshock does not describe a type of earthquake. There is no physical property that a foreshock has and an ordinary earthquake lacks. There is no signal in the seismogram, no signature in the beach ball, nothing in the depth or the duration or the frequency content that marks an earthquake as a foreshock at the moment it occurs. A foreshock is defined entirely by what happens afterward. An earthquake becomes a foreshock only when a bigger earthquake follows it nearby. Until that moment, it is simply an earthquake, which means that the question, is this a foreshock, is, strictly speaking, unanswerable tonight. Not because our instruments are not good enough, because of what the word means. That sounds like a dodge. It is not. It is the single most important thing to understand about the next few days, and it leads directly to a question that actually can be answered, which is, what would we expect to see if this were the beginning of something, and are we seeing it? We can answer that. There is a specific, concrete, checkable pattern. I will hand it to you before the end of this video, and it involves watching which direction the aftershocks move. But to understand why that pattern matters, you first need to understand the ground this happened in. Not the Cascadia fault of the documentaries, the clean line on the map where one plate slides under another, the real thing. The northern end, where the map gets ugly, where there are 4 plates instead of 2, where a microplate is being crushed and rotated and sheared by everything around it, and where a research vessel towing a 15-kilometre string of microphones took the first pictures of a subduction zone dying. That is where we're going next. And the first thing you need to see is the beach ball, because everything I have told you so far rests on it. Part 2. What the beach ball actually said. There is a moment, maybe 20 or 30 minutes after a significant earthquake, when the automated systems have done their work and a human seismologist has looked at the result, and a small black and white sphere appears on the event page. Most people scroll straight past it. It looks like a logo. It looks like decoration. It is the most information-rich object in the entire report. Let me explain what you're looking at, because once you can read one of these, you can answer for yourself the question that took researchers most of the 20th century to be able to answer at all. What kind of fault broke, and which way did the rock go? Imagine you could stand at the exact point where the rock first snapped and look outward in every direction. Now imagine the very first motion of the ground at every point around you. In some directions, the rock is pushed away from the source. In other directions, it is pulled toward it. Those first motions are not random. They arrange themselves into 4 neat quadrants, alternating push, pull, and the boundaries between those quadrants are determined entirely by the geometry of the fault that broke. Seismologists collect the first motion recorded at every station that felt the earthquake, project them all onto a sphere, shade the push regions black and the pull regions white, and what you get is that 4-quadrant pattern. 2 black wedges, 2 white wedges. The lines separating them are the 2 possible fault planes. 2, not 1. That is important, and it is a real limitation, not a hedge. The physics of a slipping fault produces a radiation pattern that is mathematically identical, whether the fault ran one way and slipped in one direction, or ran the perpendicular way and slipped the perpendicular direction. Those are called the nodal planes, and from the seismic waves alone you cannot tell which of the 2 was the real fault. You need extra information for that, such as where the aftershocks line up, or a mapped structure that matches one orientation. But here is what you absolutely can tell, unambiguously, with no extra information at all. The style of motion. Whether the rock moved sideways or up and over or pulled apart. And you can tell how steeply the fault is tilted. For tonight's earthquake, both of those answers came back sharp and clean. The reviewed moment tensor showed 2 possible fault planes. One of them dips at about 77 degrees. The other dips at about 86 degrees. Stop and picture that. A dip of 0 degrees means the fault is a flat horizontal surface like a sheet of paper lying on a table. A dip of 90 degrees means the fault is a perfectly vertical wall, like a pane of glass standing on its edge. 77 degrees and 86 degrees are both very close to that vertical wall. 86 is within 4 degrees of straight up and down, and the motion across those near vertical surfaces was overwhelmingly strike-slip, which means 2 blocks of oceanic crust ground past each other sideways horizontally, the way the 2 sides of the San Andreas Fault do in California. One block went one way, the other block went the other way. Almost no vertical movement at all. Now hold that image, because I am going to put the other kind of earthquake right next to it, and the contrast is the whole argument. The Cascadia Megathrust is not a vertical wall. It is close to the opposite. It is the contact surface between the top of the descending oceanic plate and the underside of the North American plate, and that contact slopes gently downward from the trench, heading inland, shallowly. Over a horizontal distance of many tens of kilometres, it descends only a few kilometres. In the locked section, the part that matters, that interface is dipping at something on the order of 10 degrees or less. It is not a wall, it is a ramp, and in a megathrust earthquake, the ocean plate does not slide sideways along that ramp. It lurches up and forward beneath the continent, and the overriding plate springs seaward and upward over the top of it. Hundreds of kilometres of ramp let go at once. The entire seafloor above the rupture heaves. That heave is everything. That is the tsunami. Not the shaking, not the noise, not the rupture itself. A tsunami is created when a large area of seafloor moves vertically and shoves the entire column of water above it upward or downward. Displace enough water fast enough over a large enough area, and you have a wave that carries across an ocean basin. So put the two side by side. Megathrust, shallow ramp, thrusting motion, enormous vertical displacement of the seafloor, tsunami. Tonight, near vertical wall, sideways motion, almost no vertical displacement of the seafloor, no tsunami. That is not an interpretation. That is not somebody's opinion about what happened. That is geometry, read directly off the radiation pattern, and it is why Earthquakes Canada could stand up within minutes and say there is no tsunami risk, without waiting to see what the water did. They did not need to wait. The beach ball had already told them. Which brings us back to the central question of this whole video, and I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a lot of coverage goes wrong in one of two directions. Direction 1 is the panic read. A 5.6 near Cascadia, the fault is overdue, the plate is tearing, therefore something is starting. That read ignores the mechanism entirely. Direction 2 is the dismissal read. It was not on the megathrust, no tsunami, no damage, nothing to see here, go back to sleep. That read ignores the location entirely. The honest position is the uncomfortable one in the middle. The mechanism rules out the thing everyone is afraid of. The location keeps the story alive. And what the mechanism actually tells us when you push on it a little harder is not just what this earthquake was not. It tells us something quite specific about what it was. Because think about what a near-vertical strike-slip fault is doing out there in the first place. You're 200 kilometers offshore. You're on the oceanic side of the system, seaward of the point where the descending plate reaches the main subduction contact beneath Vancouver Island. You're inside the ocean plate itself, not on the boundary between the ocean plate and the continent. And inside that ocean plate, there is a fault that is nearly vertical, and the rock on either side of it is grinding sideways. Oceanic crust is not supposed to be full of near-vertical faults grinding sideways. In a simple, clean subduction system, the ocean plate arrives at the trench as a more or less coherent slab bends downward and goes under. It is not supposed to be internally shredding itself on vertical cracks 200 kilometers before it gets there. So the mechanism is not merely reassuring, it is diagnostic. It is telling us that the plate arriving at northern Cascadia is being deformed internally, right now, and that the deformation is happening along steep faults with sideways motion, which is precisely, exactly, in detail, what the new research says should be happening there. The earthquake is behaving like a symptom of the tear, and that is a very different sentence from the earthquake happened on the tear, which is a claim I am not going to make, because the data does not support it. The epicenter sits somewhat west of the main mapped structure. Let me be blunt about the limits here, because I would rather be honest than dramatic. Can I tell you this was an internal fault inside the deforming explorer plate, or a strand within its network of fractures? Yes, with reasonable confidence. That is what the mechanism and the settings say. Can I tell you which fault? No, not tonight. 2 nodal planes, 1 epicenter with offshore grade uncertainty, no relocated aftershock catalogue yet. The event has the correct general style of motion for a highly sheared environment, but a beach ball on its own cannot pin a rupture to a name structure. Anyone giving you a specific fault name tonight is guessing, and dressing the guess up as analysis. Can I tell you it ruptured the image tear, the one where the slab has dropped 5 kilometers? No. In fact, I would say probably not, on location grounds. That structure is not where this epicenter plots. I know that is less satisfying than a clean answer, but the reason I trust this analysis is precisely that it stops where the data stops. And what it does tell us is enough to keep going, because it puts us inside a plate that is coming apart, which is the only reason a moderate earthquake in the open ocean deserves your evening at all. So let us go look at the difference between sideways and under a little more carefully. Because I have told you that a megathrust would produce a tsunami, and tonight's earthquake could not. But I have not told you what that actually means for the coastline, and the numbers on that are worse than most people who live there realize. Part 3. The difference between sideways and under. 8 to 15 minutes. That is the window. That is how long the outer coast of Vancouver Island, Washington and Oregon would have between the shaking stopping and the water arriving, If the thing we're talking about tonight had actually been the thing everybody's afraid of, not ours, not the comfortable transoceanic warning time you get when a tsunami is generated off Japan or Chile and travels across the Pacific with agencies tracking it the whole way. 8 to 15 minutes, because the fault that would generate it is not across an ocean. It is directly offshore, in some places only 100 kilometers or so out, and the wave does not need to travel far. I want you to understand why that number is what it is, and why tonight's earthquake, on a near-vertical fault moving sideways, could not have produced anything remotely like it. Because this is the payoff of the geometry we just walked through, and it is the reason the beach ball is not academic trivia. A tsunami is not caused by shaking. This is the single most common misunderstanding about them, and it is worth killing properly. Shaking is what happens to the ground. A tsunami is what happens to the water, and water does not care how violently the seafloor vibrates. It cares whether the seafloor moves up or down, how much of it moves, and how fast. Think about it in terms of volume. The ocean off the Pacific Northwest is a couple of kilometers of water sitting on the seafloor. If you take a patch of that seafloor 100 kilometers wide and several hundred kilometers long, and you lift the entire patch by several meters in under a minute, you have just pushed an unimaginable volume of water upward. That water has nowhere to go but out. It spreads in every direction as a very long, very low wave that barely registers in the open ocean, and then piles up catastrophically when it reaches shallow water near the coast. Now do the same thought experiment with tonight's earthquake. A near-vertical fault may be a few kilometers of rupture length for a magnitude 5.6, and the motion is sideways. The block on one side slides north, the block on the other side slides south, or whatever the exact orientation was. How much water column did that displace? Essentially none. Sideways motion moves rock past rock. The seafloor surface stays at the same elevation. There is no piston. There is no lift. You get a sharp jolt that travels through the water as sound and pressure, and you get a fairly efficient set of seismic waves rolling off through the crust to wake up Vancouver, and you get no wave. That is why the tsunami question was closed within minutes. Not optimism, geometry. But the reason I'm spending time on the version that did not happen is that it is the standard against which tonight has to be measured, and it is also the thing this channel keeps coming back to for a reason. In our video from July 15th, we spent an evening on the tremor counts creeping up along the whole length of the margin, over 300 tremor epicenters spread across the full extent of the subduction zone in a single day. That video was about the fault behaving in its slow, quiet background mode. Tonight is a different kind of signal in the same neighborhood, and the two are only connected if you understand what the megathrust would actually do. So let me put the real scenario on the table, with the real numbers, and then we will come back. The Cascadia subduction zone runs roughly 1,100 kilometers, about 680 miles, from northern California north past Oregon and Washington, and up along Vancouver Island. Along most of that boundary, the Juan de Fuca plate is being pushed beneath North America at roughly 40 millimeters a year, with published estimates running from about 30 millimeters a year at the southern end to about 45 at the northern end. In more familiar terms, roughly 4 centimeters, an inch and a half every year. That does not sound like much. Over a human lifetime it is about 3 meters. Over 3 centuries it is close to 12. And here is the part that turns an arithmetic problem into a hazard. The interface is locked. At depths shallower than about 30 kilometers, friction has the two plates gripped together, and they are not sliding. The oceanic plate keeps pushing at 4 centimeters a year regardless. So the North American plate above it bends. It compresses. It stores every millimeter of that push as elastic strain, the way a wooden ruler stores energy when you press the ends together. The coastline of Washington and Oregon and Vancouver Island is being squeezed and lifted right now by a measurable amount every year, and that stored deformation is the fuel for the earthquake everyone is waiting for. When the lock finally fails, all of it releases at once and the coast snaps seaward and drops. The last time that happened along the full margin was January 26, 1700, 326 years ago. We know the date with startling precision, not from any instrument, but from a tsunami that struck Japan on a night when no Japanese earthquake had occurred, recorded in local documents as an orphan wave. Working backwards from the arrival time and the wave height, researchers matched it to a magnitude 9 class rupture on the far side of the Pacific. The indigenous oral histories of the Pacific Northwest coast describe the same night from the other end. Cascadia is considered capable of magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, and that is the version where the coast gets 8 to 15 minutes, and where local modelling of the worst-case scenarios puts run-up on some exposed stretches at heights that get into the range of 100 feet. Now, here is where I have to add the nuance that most coverage leaves out, and it matters enormously for tonight. Cascadia does not have to rupture along its full length. The paleoseismic record, built from buried marsh soils, ghost forests and offshore turbidite layers, shows both kinds of events. Full margin ruptures where the whole thing goes at once, and partial ruptures where one segment fails and the rest holds. A rupture confined to the southern segment off Northern California and Oregon is a different disaster from a rupture confined to the northern segment off Vancouver Island, and both are different from the full 1,100 kilometres letting go together, which means the segment matters, which means the question of where a rupture starts and where it stops is not academic, and which means the structure of the plate at the ends of the fault, at the places where a rupture would either die out or keep going, is one of the most consequential open questions in North American earthquake science. And the northern end, the segment where tonight's earthquake happened, is the end that has just been discovered to be full of tears. That connection is the reason we are here. A 5.6 on a vertical crack in the ocean is, by itself, a footnote. A 5.6 on a vertical crack in the ocean, inside the segment that determines whether a northern Cascadia rupture starts, stalls, or propagates, in the same year that researchers published the first images of that segment fragmenting, is a story. I want to give you the evidence for that 1700 date in a little more detail, because it is one of the most satisfying pieces of detective work in the history of the field, and because it is the reason we can speak about Cascadia's behaviour with any confidence at all. For most of the 20th century, the Cascadia subduction zone was not considered particularly dangerous. That sounds absurd now, but it was the mainstream view. The fault was quiet. There were no great earthquakes in the written record, which along that coast begins in the late 1700s. A subduction zone that never produces subduction earthquakes was interpreted by some researchers as one where the plates were sliding smoothly past each other rather than sticking. A seismic, in the jargon. Not a threat. The evidence that overturned that view came from three completely independent directions, and the fact that they agreed is what made the case airtight. The first was the coastal geology. Along estuaries from Northern California to Vancouver Island, researchers found buried soil horizons, a layer of ordinary marsh peat, full of the roots of freshwater plants, abruptly overlain by a layer of tidal mud. That sequence has only one plausible explanation. The land dropped suddenly, by a metre or more, and the sea came in and killed everything growing there. Not gradually, because there is no transitional layer between the two. Suddenly. The second was the ghost forests, stands of dead western red cedar, still standing upright in tidal flats, killed by saltwater intrusion when the land subsided. Tree rings preserve a record of the year of death, and when researchers cross-dated the outermost rings of those trees against long regional tree ring chronologies, they found the trees stopped growing after the growing season of 1699 and before the growing season of 1700, which narrowed the event to a window between the autumn of one year and the spring of the next. The third was the Japanese archive. Coastal communities on the Pacific side of Honshu kept meticulous records of damaging waves, because damaging waves destroyed rice stores and drowned people, and mattered enormously to local administration. In those records is an entry describing a tsunami that arrived on a night in January of 1700 with no preceding earthquake. An orphan tsunami. Wave heights of 2 to 3 metres, damage in multiple villages, and no local shaking to explain it. Work backwards. A tsunami crossing the Pacific from the west coast of North America takes roughly 10 hours. Subtract 10 hours from the recorded Japanese arrival time, and you get an origin time on the evening of January 26, 1700, local time on the Cascadia margin. Take the recorded wave heights in Japan and model backwards to the source, and you need a rupture of roughly magnitude 9 along essentially the full length of the margin to produce them. 3 lines of evidence: coastal subsidence, tree death, and a foreign tsunami archive, all pointing at the same night, and then there are the offshore turbidites, which give us the longer record. Strong shaking on the continental slope triggers underwater landslides, and those landslides deposit a distinctive graded layer of sediment on the abyssal plain. Core the seafloor, and you get a stack of them, separated by ordinary background sedimentation. Count the layers, date them with radiocarbon, and you have a catalogue of past earthquakes stretching back roughly 10,000 years. That catalogue contains something on the order of 40 events along the margin over that period, which gives an average recurrence interval of a few hundred years, and which is where the phrase Cascadia is overdue comes from. I want to be careful with that word because averages are not schedules. The intervals between events in that record are highly variable, ranging from under 2 centuries to over 1,000 years. 326 years since the last one is well within the historical spread. Overdue is a rhetorical framing, not a geological one. But the turbidite record does something more useful than fuel that phrase, and it is the reason I brought it up. The layers do not all appear in every core. Some events show up in cores along the entire margin, from Vancouver Island down to Cape Mendocino. Others appear only in the southern cores. That difference is the physical evidence for segmentation, and it is the reason the question of where a rupture stops is not theoretical. So before we go any further into what happens if the Megathrust goes, I want to take you to the plate itself, the one that broke tonight. Because the standard picture, the one in every textbook diagram, is of a single oceanic plate sliding cleanly under a continent. 2 plates, 1 boundary, simple. That picture is wrong at the northern end. Badly wrong. There are not 2 plates up there. There are 4, meeting within about 300 kilometers of each other, and one of them is being pulled in 3 directions at once by the other 3. Let me show you what that does to a piece of the Earth's crust. Part 4. The reason nobody died. Before we go under the ocean, I want to stop on something that happened 2 nights earlier, about 7,000 kilometers south, because it puts tonight in a perspective that the numbers alone will not give you. On Saturday evening, July 18th, at 24 minutes past 9 local time, a magnitude 5.5 earthquake struck the Andes region of Peru. The epicenter was 2 kilometers west-southwest of the city of Secaya, in Huancayo province. The depth was 10 kilometers. Read those parameters again and compare them to tonight. Magnitude 5.5, tonight was 5.6, depth 10 kilometers, tonight was 10 to 11.5. In seismological terms, these are the same earthquake. If you handed a seismologist the 2 records with the location stripped off, they would tell you they were looking at 2 very ordinary moderate events, essentially interchangeable. 6 people are dead in Peru. More than 30 were injured. Around 300 were displaced from their homes. Buildings collapsed. Among them was the Santiago de Leon church and former convent in Chongos Bayo, built in 1565 and designated a National Heritage Site as a 16th century architectural landmark. It stood for 461 years. A moderate earthquake took it down on a Saturday night. Luis Vasquez, the head of the local civil defense office, told journalists what everyone in the field already knew when they saw the footage. The widespread use of rustic adobe construction in that part of the Andes, he said, has contributed to the greater impact and damage. Families stood outside cracked and collapsed homes while local television filmed. Same magnitude, same depth, 2 nights apart. One of them killed 6 people and destroyed a building that had survived since the Spanish colonial era. The other one woke up Vancouver. The variable was not seismology. I want to be careful with this comparison, because it is easy to turn it into a cheap moral, and that is not what it is for. The reason it belongs in this video is that it corrects a specific and dangerous instinct that shows up in the comments every time we cover an event like tonight's. The instinct is to file a magnitude 5.6 as harmless, to treat it as a number that is simply too small to matter, and therefore to treat any concern about it as overreaction. A 5.6 is not harmless. It is a fully capable destroyer of unreinforced masonry, adobe, poorly tied older construction, and anything on soft or saturated ground. It killed people this weekend. The reason nobody was hurt off Vancouver Island is that the rupture happened 208 kilometers out to sea, under 2 kilometers of water, with the nearest sizable community 300 kilometers away. Distance did the work, not magnitude, and that matters for the thread we're following because it reframes the question you should be asking about tonight. The question is not, was it big enough to be dangerous? It was not, where it happened, and everybody got to keep sleeping. The question is what it tells us about the state of the rock it happened in. A 5.6 is a fairly modest release of energy, but it is an entirely real fracture of real rock, and something had to load that rock to the point where it broke. That something is what we are chasing. It is worth understanding why adobe fails the way it does, because it explains why a moderate earthquake can flatten a district, while a larger one somewhere else leaves buildings standing. Adobe is sun-dried earth brick. It is strong in compression, which means it holds up beautifully against the weight pressing down on it from above, and that is why adobe structures can stand for centuries under static load. The Santiago de León church stood for 461 years doing exactly that. But adobe is almost worthless in tension and in shear. It has no reinforcement running through it, no steel, no timber lacing, nothing to hold the mass together when the forces stop pointing straight down. An earthquake applies horizontal acceleration. The walls are shoved sideways relative to the foundation and relative to the roof. The mortar joints open, the walls separate at the corners, where two planes of unreinforced masonry meet with nothing tying them together. And once the corners fail, the walls are freestanding slabs of heavy earth several meters tall, and they fall inward or outward depending on which way the ground was moving at that instant. The heaviest part of the building is at the top, and it comes down on whatever is beneath it. That is the entire mechanism of death in an adobe collapse, and it is why the casualty numbers in Andean, Himalayan and Middle Eastern earthquakes are so consistently higher per unit of ground motion than they are in regions with different construction traditions. 6 people died in Peru on Saturday night because of the physics of unreinforced earth walls under horizontal acceleration. Not because the earthquake was unusually strong. It was not. It was a 5.5. Now consider the same principle applied to the Pacific Northwest, because the region is not uniformly prepared and the honest picture is uneven. Modern construction in Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle and Portland is built to codes that have been progressively strengthened for decades, and specifically strengthened for subduction zone shaking after the 1700 earthquake was confirmed in the 1980s and 90s. Those buildings will perform. That is what the codes are for. The problem is everything built before the codes. Unreinforced masonry buildings, the brick structures that make up the historic cores of a lot of Pacific Northwest towns, are the same failure mechanism as adobe with better bricks. Older concrete frames without ductile detailing. Wood frame houses not bolted to their foundations, which slide off during strong shaking. Soft-story buildings with a garage or a retail space at ground level and residential floors stacked above, where the ground floor has far less lateral strength than everything it is holding up. Retrofit programs exist in all these jurisdictions. They are voluntary in most places, expensive everywhere, and progress is slow. There is a second reason the Peru comparison is worth your time, and it cuts the other way. The Peruvian earthquake was on land, under a populated valley, in a country where a lot of housing stock is adobe. The Cascadia scenario is the inverse, a much larger earthquake offshore, but with the shaking reaching cities like Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle and Portland, and with the tsunami reaching the outer coast in 8 to 15 minutes. The lesson from Sakaya is not that the Pacific Northwest is fine because its buildings are better. It is that what happens to a place in an earthquake is decided by the collision between the ground motion and the built environment, and both halves of that equation are things people can actually measure and prepare for. Which is, when you get down to it, the reason to care about a 5.6 on a vertical crack in the ocean at all, not because it will hurt anyone, it did not and it will not, but because the structure it broke is part of the same system that will eventually decide what happens to several million people on 8 to 15 minutes of warning, and every piece of information we get about how that system is put together is worth having. So let me hand you the piece of information that changes the picture. It is not about the earthquake, it is about the plate. Part 5. The plate that isn't one plate. Every diagram you have ever seen of the Cascadia subduction zone is a lie of simplification. You know the one. A cross-section, drawn left to right. Ocean on the left, continent on the right. One slab of oceanic crust sliding down and to the right beneath the edge of North America, with a row of volcanoes on top. Clean. 2 plates, 1 boundary, a conveyor belt disappearing under a continent. That diagram is a reasonable approximation for the middle of the margin, off Oregon and Washington. It falls apart completely at the northern end. Here is what is actually up there. The incoming oceanic plate at Cascadia is not one plate, it is 3 segments. The Juan de Fuca plate occupies the central portion, off Oregon and Washington, and that is the piece the textbook diagram is drawn from. To the south, off northern California, there is the Gorda plate, and to the north, off Vancouver Island, there is the Explorer plate. The Explorer plate is small, it is young, and it is being systematically destroyed by its neighbours. That is not a dramatic flourish, it is the mechanical situation. The Explorer plate sits at a junction where 4 major tectonic entities converge within about 300 kilometres or 186 miles of one another. The Pacific plate, the North American plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, and the Explorer plate itself wedged in the middle of all three. There are not many places on Earth where 4 plates crowd together that tightly, and there is nowhere else where we can watch it happening in such detail with modern instruments. What that crowding does to the Explorer plate is the key to tonight. Start with the speeds, because the speeds are where the trouble begins. The Juan de Fuca plate moves toward the continent at roughly 4 centimeters a year, about 1.5 inches. The Explorer plate, its immediate neighbor to the north, moves at approximately half that rate, around 2 centimeters a year, something like 0.8 of an inch, and some sections of it appear to move more slowly still. Published assessments have gone further and suggested that the Explorer segment may no longer be effectively subducting at all. Now think about what that means physically, because this is the part that produces earthquakes. You have 2 adjacent pieces of the same oceanic crust, sitting side by side, welded together along a boundary, and one of them is trying to move twice as fast as the other. That is a problem the rock has to solve. There are only so many ways to solve it. Either the boundary between them accommodates the difference by slipping, or the plates themselves deform internally, or both. At Cascadia's northern end, it is both, and the Explorer plate does not only have a speed disagreement with the Juan de Fuca plate to its south, it is also being pushed by the Pacific plate from the west, and it is running into North America to the east, and the directions of all those pushes are not aligned. A plate is a rigid slab only up to a point. Push it from 3 different directions at 3 different rates, and it stops behaving as a solid block. It has to bend. It has to rotate. It has to shear internally. That internal deformation is not a slow, smooth, quiet process. Rock does not bend gracefully. Rock accumulates stress and then fractures, which is exactly why you get a near-vertical strike-slip fault 208 kilometers offshore in the middle of what a textbook diagram would call a single oceanic plate, letting go at 11:41 on a Sunday night. That is the answer to the question I raised earlier, the one about why oceanic crust that is supposed to be arriving as a coherent slab is instead shredding itself on vertical cracks before it gets to the trench. It is shredding itself because it is being pulled apart and rotated by 3 neighbors with 3 different agendas, and it does not have the option of staying whole. I want to underline the central point again here, because we are now standing at the heart of it. Tonight's earthquake was not the megathrust. We know that from the mechanism. But the mechanism that rules out the megathrust is the same mechanism that identifies this as an internal deformation event inside a plate being torn to pieces. The reassuring finding and the interesting finding are the same finding. Read from 2 directions. It is worth naming the 3rd segment as well, because it makes the pattern unmistakable. At the southern end of Cascadia, off northern California, there is the Gorda plate. And the Gorda plate has almost exactly the same problem as the Explorer plate at the opposite end of the margin. It is small, it is wedged between larger neighbours, and it is famously, spectacularly deformed internally. The Gorda plate is one of the most seismically active pieces of oceanic crust on the planet, and almost none of that activity is subduction. It is internal. The plate is being squeezed between the Pacific plate to the south and the Juan de Fuca plate to the north, and it responds by fracturing along a set of internal faults that produce moderate to strong earthquakes on a regular basis. Magnitude 6 and even magnitude 7 events occur inside the Gorda plate, not on the megathrust. So the pattern at Cascadia is this: a relatively coherent, well-behaved central plate, the Juan de Fuca, doing something close to what the textbook diagram shows, and at each end a small, crushed, internally shredding microplate producing earthquakes that have nothing to do with the subduction interface at all. That is not a coincidence of geography. It is what happens at the ends of a subduction zone. The middle of a slab is supported by the slab on either side of it. The ends are not. They are free edges, and free edges are where a plate can be torn, rotated and cut off, because there is nothing beside them holding them in the same orientation, which reframes tonight considerably. A moderate earthquake inside a microplate at the end of the Cascadia margin is, in the broadest sense, the expected behaviour of that part of the system. The Gorda plate does the same thing at the other end several times a decade, and has been doing it for as long as we have been recording. What makes the northern end different from the southern end is not that it fractures. Both fracture. It is that at the northern end we now have pictures of what the fracturing is doing to the descending slab, and those pictures show a process that the Gorda plate's seismicity had only ever hinted at. Let me put a little more mechanical detail on the crushing, because squeezed from 3 sides is a phrase and I would rather you had the picture. The Explorer plate is being manufactured at the Explorer Ridge to its west, which is still spreading and still producing new crust, and still pushing that crust eastward. To its south, across the Nootka Fault Zone, sits the Juan de Fuca plate moving toward the continent roughly twice as fast. To its northwest sites the Pacific plate, moving northwest along the Queen Charlotte Fault system, dragging along the northern edge of the Explorer plate with an enormous amount of shear. And to its east sits North America, which is not moving out of the way. A plate in that position has 4 boundaries and no agreement among them. The result is that the Explorer plate rotates. It does not simply translate east and go under. It turns, and different parts of a rotating rigid body move at different velocities depending on their distance from the rotation axis, which means that even if the plate were perfectly rigid, its edges and its interior would be experiencing different amounts of strain. It is not perfectly rigid. Nothing is, so it fractures. Now, there is one more consequence of that speed difference that deserves attention, and it complicates the standard hazard story in a way that does not get discussed much. If the Explorer plate is converging with North America at roughly 2 centimeters a year rather than 4, then the rate at which strain accumulates on the subduction interface at the extreme northern end may be lower than it is off Washington and Oregon. Less convergence means less push, means less stored elastic strain per century, means potentially a different earthquake budget at that end of the margin. I want to flag that as an open question rather than a conclusion, because I have seen it stated both too confidently and not at all. The popular framing of northern Cascadia is that it is locked and loaded, that it is the most likely place for a rupture to initiate, and the locked part is well supported. Recent work describes the northern portion of the fault as locked and seismically quiet, which is exactly the signature of a segment storing strain rather than releasing it. But locked and loaded is a phrase doing a lot of work. Locked describes the friction state of the interface. Loaded describes how much strain has accumulated. Those are related but not identical, and if the convergence rate at the far northern end really is half the rate further south, then the loading side of that phrase deserves more precision than it usually gets in coverage. None of which makes northern Cascadia safe. It makes it complicated, and complicated in a system that produces magnitude 9 earthquakes is not a comfort. It is a reason to look harder. So we should look harder, because the boundary that separates the Explorer plate from the Juan de Fuca plate, the one accommodating that speed difference, is not a simple line on a map. It is a shredded zone of distributed faulting that has been widening and narrowing and reorganizing itself for 4 million years, and it has a name. It is called the Nootka Fault Zone, and it is doing something to the Pacific Northwest that we did not know was possible to observe. Part 6. The Scissors. 4 million years ago, a piece of the Pacific seafloor decided to go its own way. Up to that point, the spreading ridge system offshore of what is now British Columbia was behaving as a single unit, manufacturing new oceanic crust along a continuous line and feeding it eastward toward the continent. Then the northern portion of that ridge, the section now called the Explorer Ridge, became independent of the Juan de Fuca Ridge to its south. 2 ridges instead of 1, 2 production lines running at different speeds, feeding 2 pieces of crust that were no longer moving as one. The boundary that formed between those 2 pieces is the Nootka Fault Zone. Technically, it is what geologists call a ridge-trench-trench transform fault, which is a mouthful that just means it is a sideways slipping boundary connecting a spreading ridge to a subduction trench at each end. Practically, it is the seam where the Explorer plate to the north grinds past the Juan de Fuca plate to the south, accommodating left lateral strike-slip motion. Left lateral means that if you stand on one side and look across, the other side has moved to your left. But calling it a fault singular gives entirely the wrong impression. This is the detail that matters most for understanding tonight. The split of the Juan de Fuca plate was not a clean break. It did not happen along a single crack. When it began, the zone of active faulting was at least 80 kilometers wide. 80 kilometers of crust, all of it fracturing, all of it accommodating motion across a broad band rather than a single surface. Over the 4 million years since, that zone has narrowed. Today it is somewhere between 8 and 18 kilometers wide, which sounds like it is organizing itself, tightening up, resolving into something simpler. It is not, and here is the part that should stay with you. Narrowing means that the currently active faulting has concentrated into a smaller band. It does not mean the rest of the 80 kilometers healed. All those older fractures are still there, buried in the crust, and the published work is explicit that this zone is surrounded by numerous buried, steeply dipping, small offset growth faults, at least some of which are likely still active. Read that again with tonight's beach ball in mind. Steeply dipping, small offset, likely still active. That is a near-perfect description of what broke at 11:41 on Sunday night. A steep fault, in this zone, with a small amount of slip releasing a magnitude 5.6. There is more, and it makes the picture stranger. Analysis of the fault orientations shows they run sub-parallel to the seafloor magnetic anomalies, the frozen stripes of alternating magnetic polarity that record the crust's manufacture at the spreading ridge. The faults appear to have reused extensional faults that were originally formed at the ridge itself when the crust was young and hot and being pulled apart. So the crust arrives at this boundary already carrying the scars of its own creation, and the shearing between the two plates finds those old weaknesses and reactivates them. The rock is not inventing new ways to break. It is failing along lines that were drawn into it millions of years ago when it was born. That is why the whole northern margin is riddled with faults, rather than carrying one clean boundary. The crust was pre-weakened. The tectonics is exploiting it. There is a chemical dimension to this zone that took me by surprise when I first read about it, and it is worth 2 minutes because it changes how you should picture the rock down there. Work published in 2018 by Kristin Rohr and colleagues in the journal Geochemistry, Geophysics, Geosystems examined the initiation of the strike-slip faults in this zone and found something that goes beyond mechanics. The faults are pathways for water. Here is why that matters. Oceanic crust sits on top of the mantle, and the uppermost mantle beneath oceanic crust is made largely of a mineral called olivine. Olivine is dry, hard, and strong. But if you introduce seawater to olivine at the right temperatures, it reacts, and the product of that reaction is a mineral called serpentine. The process is called serpentinization, and it is one of the most consequential chemical reactions in plate tectonics. Serpentine is weak, dramatically weaker than the olivine it replaced. It is slippery, low in density, and it deforms rather than fracturing under stress. When you serpentinize the mantle beneath a fault zone, you have converted strong rock into weak rock along that pathway, and you have done it permanently. So the faults in the Nootka zone are not simply cracks. They are conduits that allow seawater to reach mantle rock, and the reaction that follows makes the fault zone progressively weaker over time. The faulting enables the chemistry, and the chemistry enables more faulting. It is a feedback loop that runs in one direction only. The reaction also releases methane, which is why that study's title mentions it, and which is detectable at the seafloor. Now put that together with the tearing. A plate boundary that is being mechanically sheared, chemically weakened along its fault pathways, and progressively cut apart into microplates is not going to behave like the clean rigid boundary in a textbook diagram. It is going to behave like something that is falling apart because chemically and mechanically it is. There is one more study that deserves a mention here, because it is the reason we can talk about this zone in any detail at all. In 2022, a team led by Merrill published a double difference tomography study of the Nootka fault zone in the same journal, along with an entirely new earthquake catalogue for the region. Double difference tomography is a technique for improving earthquake locations by comparing the arrival times of waves from pairs of nearby events at the same stations. If two earthquakes are close together, the paths their waves take to a distant station are nearly identical, so most of the errors introduced by an imperfect velocity model cancel out. What survives is a much more precise measurement of the position of each event relative to the other. Apply that across thousands of earthquakes and the fuzzy cloud of epicenters that a standard catalogue gives you collapses into sharp lines. Those sharp lines are the actual faults. That work is what turned the Nootka fault zone from an approximate boundary on a map into a resolvable network of individual structures, and it is exactly the kind of analysis that will eventually be applied to Sunday night's event, which is why I keep saying that the fault identification is a question of time rather than a question of possibility. And the Nootka fault zone does not stop at the coastline. Its extension continues beneath Vancouver Island, and it has generated sizable earthquakes felt by island residents. In fact, the largest crustal earthquakes recorded on Vancouver Island itself have occurred on the onshore projection of the Nootka transform, and they were characterized by that same left lateral strike-slip motion. Let me connect that back to where we started because it is easy to lose. The people who felt shaking last night on northern Vancouver Island live above the inland continuation of the same structure that broke offshore. Not the same fault necessarily, the same system, the same shearing, the same style, the same underlying cause, two pieces of ocean floor that cannot agree on how fast to move. Now, the researchers who study this zone in detail have given us a metaphor that I think is the single most useful image in this entire story, and it comes from the study we're about to get into. Transform faults like the Nootka act as natural scissors. A spreading ridge builds crust, a subduction zone consumes it, and a transform fault running across the grain of that system cuts it. Over 4 million years, motion along the Nootka fault zone has allowed the crust to tear apart, and the pieces that get cut off begin to move independently. They become microplates. They stop being part of the larger slab and start being their own small, awkward, separately moving fragments. The Explorer plate is one of those pieces. It was cut off the Juan de Fuca plate by these scissors, and it has been moving independently ever since at half the speed, in a slightly different direction, being crushed from 3 sides. Which brings us to the obvious and uncomfortable question. If the scissors cut once 4 million years ago and produced the Explorer plate, are they still cutting? Until very recently, that question was answered with inference, with modelling, with comparisons to ancient fragments preserved elsewhere in the world. Nobody had ever directly seen a subduction zone in the act of being cut apart, because the cutting happens kilometres beneath the seafloor and takes millions of years, and neither of those conditions is friendly to observation. Then, in the summer of 2021, a research vessel spent weeks dragging a 15-kilometre instrument array back and forth across exactly this piece of ocean, firing sound into the seabed and listening to what came back, and in September of 2025 the pictures were published. Part 7. The Ultrasound. The research vessel Marcus G. Langseth is not a glamorous ship. It is operated by the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and its job is to make pictures of things nobody can see. In 2021 it ran a program called the Cascadia Seismic Imaging Experiment, shortened to CASI-21, and the method it used is worth understanding, because the result depends entirely on it. The technique is called seismic reflection imaging. The principle is the same one behind a medical ultrasound, and the comparison is not loose. You send a pulse of sound energy down into a body. Wherever that sound crosses a boundary between materials of different density or different acoustic properties, some of it reflects back. You record what comes back, you record how long it took, and from thousands upon thousands of those returning signals you reconstruct an image of the structures buried inside. An ultrasound does this through a few centimetres of tissue. CASI-21 did it through kilometres of water, and then many more kilometres of rock. The Langseth towed an array of hydrophones 15 kilometres long. 9 miles of listening equipment, dragged behind a single ship, back and forth across the ocean off Vancouver Island, capturing the signals reflecting off structures buried beneath the seafloor. What comes back is not a photograph. It is a cross-section, a vertical slice through the Earth's crust, showing the layers, the boundaries, and critically, the places where those layers have been cut and displaced. The results were published in the journal Science Advances on September 24, 2025, by Brandon Shuck of Louisiana State University and colleagues. The paper is titled Slab Tearing and Segmented Subduction Termination, Driven by Transform Tectonics, and it is open access, which means anyone can read the whole thing for free. Here is what the pictures showed. 2 active tears splitting the tectonic plate beneath the northern Cascadia margin. Not cracks near the surface, not fractures in the shallow sediment. The tearing is happening inside the descending slab itself, in the portion of the plate that has already gone beneath North America and is being dragged downward by its own weight. Along one of these structures, the seismic profiles show a vertical drop of approximately 5 kilometres. That is about 3.1 miles, or somewhere in the range of 16,400 feet. One section of the slab sits 5 kilometres lower than the section immediately beside it. And this offset is not local. The structure extends approximately 75 kilometres, about 47 miles. I need to stop here and make a clarification that a lot of coverage of this study has managed to garble, and getting it wrong turns a genuinely interesting finding into nonsense. The slab did not drop 5 kilometres in an earthquake. There was no event in which a piece of the Pacific Northwest fell 3 miles. That is not what the image shows, and it is not what the paper says. What the image shows is a cumulative geological offset. The plate has been bending as it descends, and fracturing as it bends, and progressively detaching along that fracture over a very long period of time. Millimetres per year, over an enormously long stretch of time, adds up to 5 kilometers of separation. The number is a total, accumulated across a timescale that dwarfs the entire history of our species. It is not a headline about something that happened. Now that the clarification is in place, let me tell you why the finding is still remarkable, because the correction does not deflate it at all. We have known for a long time, in theory, that subduction zones do not last forever. Every one of them eventually stops. The evidence for that is preserved in the geological record in the form of fossil microplates, chunks of ancient oceanic crust that were cut off from their parent slabs and left stranded. Off Baja California, geologists have identified fossil microplates that were once part of the Farallon Plate, an enormous slab that subducted beneath North America tens of millions of years ago and has almost entirely disappeared into the mantle. Those stranded fragments are the scars of a subduction system that came apart. But scars only tell you that something happened. They do not tell you how. Nobody had ever caught a subduction zone in the act. No one had directly imaged the process of a slab tearing while it was tearing. Cascadia's northern end is the first modern example, and Cassie 21 is the first set of pictures of it. Shuck's own description of what they were looking at is the line that has stuck with me since I first read it. He compared it to watching a train derail one car at a time. That image does a lot of work. A train derailment is not one event, it is a sequence. The first car goes, and the coupling to the second car fails, and the second car goes, and the process propagates down the length of the train, each failure making the next one more likely. It is not simultaneous, and it is not smooth, and it is absolutely not reversible. The mechanism has a formal name in the paper: episodic termination. Northern Cascadia's subduction is not collapsing in a single event. It is winding down in stages, and each stage is a tear. And here is where the whole thing connects back to the scissors and to tonight. The transform faults, the Nootka fault zone system, are what enable the tearing. They cut the incoming plate into pieces. Each piece that gets separated then behaves independently, and critically, each detachment weakens the downward pull on everything still attached. That pull has a name too: slab pull. It is one of the primary engines that drives plate tectonics in the first place. A subducting slab is cold and dense, denser than the mantle it is sinking into, and its own weight drags the rest of the plate along behind it like a tablecloth being pulled off a table. Take away a piece of the slab, and you have taken away a piece of the engine, which means the process is self-reinforcing. Each tear reduces the pull. Less pull means slower subduction. Slower subduction means the system is less able to overcome the resistance of the next fragment, and so it degrades, episode by episode, until it stops. The paper projects that the Explorer plate will fully detach from the subducting slab within approximately 1 million years. When it does, the active Cascadia subduction zone will be about 75 kilometers shorter than it is today, which is roughly 1/12 of its current length. 1/12 of the Cascadia subduction zone is scheduled to stop existing. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like the beginning of good news. It sounds like the fault is dying, and if the fault is dying, then surely the threat is receding, and surely the reasonable response to tonight's earthquake is relief rather than attention. That is precisely the reading I want to take apart next. Because it is wrong, and the way in which it is wrong is more interesting than the correction itself. But before we get there is one more finding in this study that I have not told you about yet. It is not the 5-kilometer drop. It is not the 75-kilometer tear. It is something quieter, and once I explain what it means, I suspect it will be the detail from this whole video that you remember. Along that 75-kilometer fault, some sections are seismically active, and some sections have gone completely silent. Part 8. The silent sections. In almost every context in seismology, silence on a fault is the thing that worries people. The logic is straightforward, and it is drilled into anyone who follows this subject. A fault that produces regular small earthquakes is a fault that is releasing stress in manageable increments. A fault that has gone quiet, in a region where the plates are still moving, is a fault that is accumulating stress without releasing it. Silence means loading. Silence means the debt is growing. The quiet segments are the ones that keep seismologists up at night, and the entire concept of a seismic gap is built on that reasoning. Now apply that instinct to what Casey 21 found, and then watch it fail. Along the 75 kilometers of the imaged tear, earthquake data show that some sections remain active. Rock is grinding against rock, stress is building and releasing, small events register. Those are the parts of the structure that are still connected. Other sections produce nothing at all, and the researchers' interpretation of those quiet zones is not that stress is building there. It is that those sections have already detached. Read that carefully, because it inverts the usual logic completely. The silence is not the sound of a fault loading. It is the sound of a fault that has stopped being a fault. There is no stress accumulating across those sections, because there is nothing left in contact to accumulate stress between. The slab there is not stuck. It is separated. That is a genuinely unsettling thing to be able to say about a piece of the earth, and it is unsettling in a way that has nothing to do with imminent danger. It is unsettling conceptually. We're used to thinking of the crust as continuous, as a shell, as a thing that might crack but remains fundamentally one object. What the images show is a region where the answer to what is on the other side of this fault has started to be nothing in any mechanically meaningful sense. Shuck's second quote about the process captures the tone of it exactly. It is a progressive breakdown, he said, one episode at a time. So now let us deal with the interpretation that I flagged at the end of the last part, the one that says, if Cascadia is dying, that must be good news. Here is what the researchers actually say, and I want to give it to you straight rather than filtered, because it is the most important paragraph in this entire video. The findings do not change the current earthquake risk for the Pacific Northwest. The tearing occurs at rates of only a few millimeters per year. That is far slower than any process that operates on human timescales. Cascadia remains fully capable of producing magnitude 8.5 to 9.0 earthquakes and the tsunamis that come with them. Nothing about the discovery of the tears reduces that capability by any measurable amount within any time frame that matters to a person alive today. Shuck himself framed the discovery as offering perspective rather than alarm. So the honest summary is this. A million years of gradual shutdown does absolutely nothing for someone living in Victoria or Port Alberni or Seattle in 2026. The subduction zone is winding down on a schedule so slow that the entire recorded history of human civilization would fit into the rounding error. If you inherit the world, and your descendants inherit it, and their descendants inherit it, for something like 40,000 generations, then the last of them might notice a difference. That is the correction to the reassurance reading, and I think it is important to state it plainly because a viewer who saw a headline last year reading, "The Cascadia subduction zone is shutting down," and then saw a magnitude 5.6 off Vancouver Island tonight, is holding two ideas that appear to contradict each other. They do not contradict each other. One is about a million-year process and the other is about Sunday night, and the only thing they have in common is the piece of ocean they are describing. Now let me deal with the other reading because there are always two. Every time this kind of finding gets published, a claim starts circulating that the interesting research is somehow a cover, that the Cascadia is dying framing was released to calm people down while something else is going on, or, running in the opposite direction, that the tear itself means the big one is imminent and that the reassuring language in the press releases is concealment. I want to take both of those seriously enough to actually address them rather than sneer at them, because the underlying instinct that institutions sometimes shade information is not irrational. But look at what the record here actually shows. The Shuck study was published open access, not paywalled, not restricted, not summarized through a press office. The full paper, with its figures and its data, is available to anyone with an internet connection for free. The CASI 21 data is publicly archived. The cruise was funded publicly, the instrumentation was documented, and the raw material is available to other researchers who want to check the interpretation. When tonight's earthquake occurred, the United States Geological Survey and Earthquakes Canada both issued location, depth, and magnitude within minutes. Earthquakes Canada then went further and issued an explicit public statement that there was no risk of tsunami, which is exactly the sort of thing an agency engaged in concealment would decline to commit to. And the Cascadia Region Earthquake Science Centre, which coordinates a lot of this work, publishes its hazard modelling. The information asymmetry here does not run the direction the suspicion assumes. There is far more public data on the state of the Cascadia subduction zone than any individual has time to read. That is not a system withholding information. That is a system producing more information than the public can absorb, which is a real problem, but it is a completely different problem. As for the version that says the tear means the big one is imminent, that is the same error as the reassurance reading, just pointed the other way. Both take a process measured in millimeters per year and compress it into human time. The tear changes the structure of northern Cascadia. It does not change the schedule. While I am here, I will deal briefly with the ones that come up in the comments every single time. Earthquake weather, lunar triggering, solar activity causing quakes. There is no established mechanism by which surface weather conditions influence rock failure 10 kilometers below the seafloor. The pressures and temperatures involved are not in the same universe as anything the atmosphere does, and tidal triggering effects, where they are detectable at all, are marginal and have never predicted an individual event. I am not going to build a section around it. But there is one alternative idea in this story that is not fringe at all, and it comes from the published discussion of the study itself. When a slab breaks off, the gap it leaves behind has a name. It is called a slab window, and what comes up through a slab window is hot mantle. Normally, the descending slab acts as a barrier between the mantle beneath it and the region above. Remove a piece of the slab and you have opened a hole in that barrier. Hot mantle material can rise through the opening, and where hot mantle rises into shallower, lower pressure conditions, it melts. The research suggests that such windows could form beneath the Pacific Northwest as fragments continue to pull away, and that this could eventually change how heat and magma circulate beneath the region. That is a genuinely strange thought. The Cascade volcanoes, Baker and Rainier and St. Helens and Hood and the rest, exist because of subduction. They are fed by water driven off the descending plate, which lowers the melting point of the mantle above it. If the northern end of the subduction system fragments, the plumbing that feeds volcanism at that end changes, and slab windows introduce an entirely different heat source into the picture. I want to be extremely clear that this has no bearing on current volcanic hazard. Nothing about Mount Baker or Garibaldi changes because of this. The timescales are geological, but it is the same process that produced the fault that broke Sunday night, followed forward to its logical conclusion, and it is in the paper, not in the comment section. So that is the structure, a microplate being crushed from three sides, cut apart by transform scissors, tearing internally, with some sections still grinding and some sections already gone. That is the ground tonight's earthquake happened in. Now I want to take you back to the thing we're all actually afraid of, and ask a harder question. If the northern end of Cascadia is this broken, this fragmented, this full of independent blocks and detached sections, what does that do to a megathrust rupture that arrives there? Does the broken ground stop it, or does it start it? Part 9. The barrier or the trigger. There is a question buried in everything we have covered so far, and it is the question that turns this from an interesting piece of geology into something with consequences for several million people. An earthquake rupture is not an instantaneous event. That is the thing most people picture wrong, and correcting it changes everything. When a megathrust fails, it does not fail everywhere at once. The rupture starts at a point, and then it propagates. A tear runs along the fault surface at a couple of kilometers per second, and behind the advancing tear the rock has slipped and released its stored strain. The rupture front travels for as long as it can find conditions ahead of it that let it keep going, and then it stops. The magnitude of the earthquake is determined almost entirely by how far that tear runs before it stops. If a Cascadia rupture starts off Oregon and runs 100 kilometers before dying, you get something in the high sevens. Serious, damaging, survivable. If it starts off Oregon and runs 1,100 kilometers, all the way up past Vancouver Island, it does not stop until the whole margin has let go, and you get a magnitude 9. So the entire difference between a regional disaster and a civilizational one comes down to a question of propagation. What lets a rupture keep going, and what makes it stop? And this is where the tears become interesting in a way that is not academic at all. The paleoseismic record already tells us Cascadia does both. Buried marsh soils along the coast record sudden subsidence events, where the land dropped and saltwater flooded in and killed the vegetation, leaving a distinct layer. Ghost forests standing dead trees drowned by that subsidence mark the same events. And offshore, turbidite layers, underwater landslides triggered by strong shaking, are stacked in cores from the continental slope, each one a fingerprint of a past earthquake. Read those records along the length of the margin, and you can see which events show up everywhere, and which show up in only one segment. Full margin ruptures, partial ruptures, both are in the history, which means the fault has boundaries, places where ruptures have historically started and stopped. And the question of what makes a boundary is one of the most consequential open problems in the field. The Shuck study's own discussion offers a possibility, and I want to give it to you as they framed it. because it is speculation grounded in mechanism rather than speculation dressed as prediction. Sections of detached crust, they suggest, might act as partial barriers. A rupture racing north along the Megathrust arrives at a region where the descending slab is no longer a continuous coherent sheet, where it has been torn, offset by 5 kilometers, cut into blocks that move independently. And a rupture front is a coherent phenomenon. It needs continuous, similarly stressed fault surface ahead of it to keep advancing. Hand it a chaotic mess of independent fragments, and the mechanical continuity it requires may simply not be there. Under that reading, the fragmentation at the northern end is protective, not because it reduces the stored strain, but because it might stop a rupture from propagating all the way through. A tear that would otherwise have run the full 1100 kilometers gets to the northern end, hits the broken zone, and dies. You still get a catastrophe, you get a smaller one. That is the optimistic version, and it has real physics behind it. Now the other version. Rupture boundaries are not only where ruptures stop, they are also where ruptures start. The same structural complexity that can arrest a propagating tear can also be the place where stress concentrates and where failure initiates. A boundary in a fault system is a stress concentrator by definition, because it is the place where the mechanical properties change abruptly, and abrupt changes in mechanical properties are where things break first. So the fragmented northern segment could be the wall that stops a rupture coming from the south, or it could be the floor where the next rupture begins, and from which it propagates southward into cleaner, more continuous, more thoroughly locked fault surface. It could be both, depending entirely on where a given rupture happens to start. Nobody knows which. That is not me being coy. That is the actual state of the science as of tonight. Scientists within the Cascadia Region Earthquake Science Centre are working on exactly this, incorporating the newly imaged structures into hazard models, mapping how faults and slab fragments interact, trying to refine predictions of rupture behaviour across the region. That work is underway. It is not finished. The answer has not been published. And this is the reason I keep coming back to the same point about tonight. A magnitude 5.6 on a near-vertical fault inside a plate being torn apart in the segment that determines whether a northern Cascadia rupture starts, stalls, or runs is a data point in an unresolved question with enormous stakes. It is not a warning. I want to be careful with that word. Nothing about this event constitutes a warning of anything, but it is information, arriving from a place we have very little information about, at exactly the moment when the people building the hazard models are trying to figure out how that place behaves. I want to add one more layer to the barrier question, because there is a piece of physics in it that is genuinely counterintuitive. The thing that stops a rupture is not usually strength. It is not that the rupture front runs into rock that is simply too tough to break. The thing that stops a rupture is usually a change in conditions that starves the front of energy. A propagating rupture is, energetically, a self-sustaining process. As it advances, the slip behind it releases stored strain energy, and some of that released energy goes into driving the front further forward. As long as the energy released behind exceeds the energy required to break new ground ahead, the rupture keeps going and it accelerates. Break that balance and the front stops, sometimes very abruptly. You can break it in several ways. You can run the front into a patch of fault that has already slipped recently, and therefore has little stored strain left to release. You can run it into a region where the fault geometry changes orientation, so that the stress-driving slip is no longer aligned with the direction of easy motion. You can run it into a region where the fault surface is not continuous at all, where instead of one interface there are several, offset from each other, each requiring the rupture to jump a gap. That last one is the case at northern Cascadia, and jumping gaps is something ruptures do badly. There is a substantial body of work on rupture jumping across fault stepovers, and the general finding is that gaps of more than about 5 kilometers are difficult for a rupture to cross. Beyond that, the front usually dies. Now recall the number from the imaging. The slab tear shows a vertical offset of approximately 5 kilometers. I am not going to claim that number is directly the stepover distance a rupture would have to cross, because the geometry is more complicated than that, and the paper does not make that claim. But it does tell you the scale of the discontinuity we're talking about. This is not a subtle change in fault properties. It is a 5-kilometer displacement in the descending slab along a structure 75 kilometers long. There is a second mechanism worth mentioning, which is thermal. The temperature of the fault interface controls whether it behaves in a stick-slip manner, storing stress and releasing it suddenly, or in a stable sliding manner, creeping continuously without ever building up enough stress for a large earthquake. The transition between those behaviors occurs over a fairly narrow temperature range. If slab fragmentation and slab windows change the thermal structure of the northern margin, they could change where that transition sits, which would change the down dip and along strike limits of the locked zone. That is speculation on my part, extended from the published mechanism rather than stated in the paper, and I want to label it as such. But it is the sort of question that the modelling work now underway will have to confront. Let me put one more number on the locked zone before we move on, because I want the stakes to be concrete rather than abstract. The interface is locked by friction at depths shallower than about 30 kilometres, and recent work characterises the northern portion as locked and seismically quiet. The convergence continues at roughly 40 millimetres a year regardless. 326 years have passed since January 26th, 1700. Do the arithmetic. 326 years times 4 centimetres a year is roughly 13 metres of convergence that has occurred without the locked interface slipping. 13 metres of relative motion between two plates that are not moving relative to each other at the surface because they are stuck. That deficit does not disappear. It is stored as elastic strain in the rock, and it will be recovered. The only question has ever been when and over what length of fault, which is why a moderate earthquake in that neighbourhood makes people sit up, even when the mechanism says it was something else entirely. The neighbourhood has a 13-metre debt outstanding. Now, before we get to the Foreshock question directly, I want to show you the closest thing we have to a controlled experiment on exactly this scenario. Because this is not the first time a significant earthquake has struck inside the Explorer plate, and the last time it happened, we got extraordinarily lucky with the instrumentation. Part 10. What happened here in 2014. In January of 2014, a team of researchers deployed a network of seismometers along the west coast of Vancouver Island in the Nootka Sound region. The deployment was called CJ2, and it was planned to run for 9 months. The goal was ordinary science: record the background seismicity of a poorly monitored offshore region in higher resolution than the permanent network could manage. 3 months into that deployment, on April 24, 2014, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck in exactly the region they were listening to. The instruments were already in the water and on the ground, in the right place, at the right density before the earthquake occurred. That almost never happens. Offshore earthquakes are usually recorded by distant land stations with poor geometry, which is why offshore depths are so badly constrained. This one was captured in unusual detail because a 9-month experiment happened to overlap with it. The main shock and its aftershocks became known as the Nootka sequence, and what that sequence revealed matters directly for tonight. The largest aftershock, a magnitude 5.3, occurred approximately 13 minutes after the main shock, with an epicenter about 20 kilometers to the southeast. But the real finding was structural. The distribution of the main shock and aftershock hypocenters mapped out a previously unknown fault, approximately 40 kilometers long, subducted, and located inside the Explorer plate to the north of the Nootka fault zone. A 40-kilometer fault that nobody knew existed, inside the plate, discovered only because it broke while a temporary instrument array happened to be watching. That should recalibrate how you hear my earlier refusal to name the fault that broke Sunday night. It is not that seismologists are being unhelpfully cautious. It is that this region demonstrably contains major faults that are not on any map, and the way we find them is by watching them rupture with enough instruments nearby to resolve the geometry. The 2014 sequence told us more than that the fault existed. It told us how the plate is deforming. The hypercenters showed the subducting plate bending downward to the northwest, nearly perpendicular to the direction of subduction. Read that again, because it is a strange sentence. The plate is supposed to be bending downward in the direction it is going, the way a sheet of paper bends as you push it under a door. Instead, it is bending sideways relative to its own motion. It is deforming parallel to the continental margin rather than simply sliding cleanly beneath North America. And the fault itself was inferred to be a subducted conjugate fault, based on its nearly identical orientation to faults found seaward of the subduction front within the Nootka fault zone. Conjugate means it belongs to the same family, formed under the same stress field, oriented as the natural complement to the main structures. That subducted fault was a piece of the Nootka system that had already been carried down beneath the continent and was still active down there. It is worth pausing on why the CJ2 deployment mattered so much, because it explains one of the running frustrations in this entire story: why we know so little about earthquakes that happen at sea. Almost all permanent seismometers are on land. That is not laziness. Ocean bottom seismometers are expensive. They have to be deployed and recovered by ship. Their batteries run out. They cannot transmit data in real time without extremely costly cabled infrastructure, and the ocean floor is a hostile environment for sensitive instruments. So the permanent networks that monitor the Pacific Northwest sit almost entirely on the continent. Now think about the geometry that creates. An earthquake occurs 200 kilometers offshore. Every station that records it is to the east. There are no stations to the west, none to the north over open water, none directly above. To locate an earthquake, you need to solve for 4 unknowns at once: latitude, longitude, depth, and origin time. The horizontal position is reasonably well constrained even by a one-sided network, because the differences in arrival time across stations spread north to south still give you good leverage. Depth is different. Depth trades off directly against origin time in the solution. An event that is shallower and slightly earlier produces almost the same arrival times as an event that is a little further down and slightly later. Without a station close to directly above the source, those two possibilities are very hard to separate. This is why offshore depths carry so much uncertainty, and it is why you frequently see the value 10 kilometers attached to offshore events. In many catalogues, that number is not a measurement at all. It is a fixed default that the location algorithm uses when depth cannot be resolved. When it is a real constrained measurement, it is usually flagged as such. That is exactly the situation with Sunday night. Preliminary depth of 10 kilometers, reviewed moment tensor depth of about 11.5. The difference is not a contradiction between agencies or a sign that anyone got it wrong. It is what depth determination looks like when all your instruments are on one side. CJADE-2 temporarily fixed that geometry. Stations in the Nootka Sound region, on the western coast of Vancouver Island, are as close as it is practically possible to get to that offshore zone while still being on land. 9 months of continuous recording at that density produced a dataset good enough to resolve individual fault planes in the aftershock cloud, which is why a 40-kilometer structure could be identified at all. Without that deployment, the 2014 event would have been a magnitude 6.4 with a fuzzy epicenter, a poorly constrained depth, and a beach ball, which is very close to exactly what we have for Sunday night. So put the 2014 sequence and Sunday night together, because they are telling the same story with different details. 2014, a magnitude 6.4 on an unmapped internal fault inside the Explorer plate, revealing a plate that is bending in the wrong direction and carrying its transform fault scars down with it as it descends. Sunday night, a magnitude 5.6 on a near-vertical strike-slip fault in the same system, west of the mapped Nootka structures, consistent with the same internal deformation and unmappable to a specific fault with the data currently in hand. These are two expressions of the same thing: a plate that cannot go under cleanly because it is being cut apart, and that fractures internally as a consequence. And here is the piece of that comparison that I think matters most for the question in the title of this video. The 2014 event was a magnitude 6.4. That is a substantially larger earthquake than Sunday night's. In terms of energy release, a 6.4 is roughly 16 times a 5.6. It did not trigger a Cascadia megathrust rupture. 12 years have passed. The megathrust is still locked, still quiet, still storing strain. A significantly larger earthquake, in the same plate, in the same system, produced a normal aftershock sequence and then faded, and the fault everybody's afraid of did not respond. I offer that as context rather than as a guarantee, because the past behavior of a fault system is evidence about how it works, not a promise about what it will do. But it is real evidence, and it points in a specific direction. Moderate to strong earthquakes inside the Explorer plate appear to be a normal expression of a plate being torn apart. They are the sound of the tearing, not a countdown to something else. That is the most likely reading of Sunday night. An internal fracture in a deforming microplate, one of many, in a system that produces them regularly, and that has produced larger ones without consequence for the megathrust. Which brings us finally to the question in the title, and I am not going to soften it. If that is the most likely reading, why did I say this is not a good sign? The answer requires understanding what the word foreshock actually means, and I promise you that when we get to the end of it, the reason a 5.6 off Vancouver Island deserves your attention will be sharper, not vaguer than it is right now. Part 11. The word foreshock only exists in the past tense. Here is a question that sounds simple and is not. What is the difference between a foreshock and an ordinary earthquake? Take a moment with it. Think about what you would look for. A different waveform, a characteristic frequency, some precursor signal in the seconds before rupture, a particular depth or duration or pattern of energy release that marks an earthquake as the opening act rather than the whole show. There is none. There is no difference, not one that anyone has ever found. A foreshock is not a type of earthquake. It is a label applied retroactively by human beings after a larger earthquake occurs nearby. There is no physical property that distinguishes one at the moment it happens, because at the moment it happens it is not one. It becomes one later, or it does not, and nothing about the earthquake itself changes when the label gets applied. That is not a limitation of our instruments. We could put a seismometer every 100 meters across the entire Pacific Northwest, sample at any rate we like, and record every event down to magnitude -2, and it would not help. The classification depends on a future event that has not happened yet. There is nothing to measure. So when someone asks, was tonight's earthquake a foreshock? The honest answer is that the question cannot be answered tonight. Not by me, not by the USGS, not by Earthquakes Canada, not by anyone. It is not a question about the earthquake. It is a question about the next few days. I know that is unsatisfying, but I think it is also freeing, because once you stop trying to answer an unanswerable question, you can start asking the ones that do have answers. And the first of those is, how often does this actually happen? We have real numbers on that, and they are worth knowing. Worldwide, the probability that any given earthquake will be followed within 3 days by a larger earthquake nearby is somewhat over 6%. Extend the window to a week, and the figure is around 5%. In California, where the statistics have been studied in the most detail because the catalogues are the longest and most complete, the number is about 6%. Now, there is a wrinkle in those statistics that surprises most people. The probability is not strongly dependent on the magnitude of the potential foreshock, at least between magnitude 3 and magnitude 5. A magnitude 3 has roughly the same chance of being followed by something bigger as a magnitude 5 does. The physics does not appear to care much how big the first event was. What does change with magnitude is the size of what might follow. The probability that an earthquake will be followed by a magnitude 5.0 or larger main shock rises with the magnitude of the first event, from under 1% for events of magnitude 3 or above, up to 6.5%, plus or minus 2.5 for events of magnitude 5 or above. Sunday night was a 5.6, so we are in that upper bracket. Let me translate all of that into plain language, because percentages are slippery. Roughly 19 out of every 20 moderate earthquakes are not followed by anything larger. If you had to bet, and you bet that this was an ordinary event that will fade into a normal aftershock sequence and be forgotten in a fortnight, you would win that bet the overwhelming majority of the time. But that also means the honest answer is not no. It is somewhere around a 1 in 20 proposition, and 1 in 20 is not 0. It is not close to 0. It is a real number that shows up in real life regularly, and any framing that treats a 5.6 near a locked megathrust as definitively nothing is overstating the certainty just as badly as the panic framing does in the other direction. That is the space the title of this video lives in. Not, the big one is coming. Not, nothing to see here. A genuine, quantified, roughly 6% window in which the truthful statement is that we cannot rule it out, and we will not be able to rule it out for several days, and that is simply how this works. Now, there is something else in those statistics that I have been circling and should say directly. The reason foreshocks are only identifiable in hindsight is not merely a definitional quirk. It reflects something real about how faults fail. A moderate earthquake occurring on a fault that is nowhere near failure produces an aftershock sequence and nothing else. The exact same moderate earthquake, occurring on or adjacent to a fault that was already sitting a hair below its failure threshold, can be the thing that tips it over. The difference is not in the earthquake. The difference is in the state of the surrounding rock, which is precisely the thing we cannot measure directly. We can measure convergence rates. We can measure locking with satellite geodesy. We can count tremor, as we did in our video from July 15th, when over 300 tremor epicenters lit up across the full length of the margin in a single day. We can model stress accumulation. What we cannot do is look at a locked interface and read off how close it is to failure, because that would require knowing the absolute stress and the absolute strength of the rock, and we can measure neither. So we are left doing statistics on a system whose critical variable is hidden. 6% is not ignorance. 6% is what you get when you honestly integrate over everything you cannot see. There is a historical case that makes this concrete in a way the statistics cannot, and it is the one every seismologist thinks about when this question comes up. On March 9th, 2011, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of northeastern Japan. It was a significant event. It generated a small tsunami. It was analysed, reported, and treated as what it appeared to be, a large earthquake in a region that produces large earthquakes regularly. 2 days later, on March 11th, the magnitude 9.0 Tohoku earthquake ruptured essentially the same part of the subduction zone, generated the tsunami that killed roughly 18,000 people, and caused the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. The March 9th event is now universally described as a foreshock. Nobody described it that way on March 10th. And here is the part that I think is genuinely important rather than merely dramatic. The people who did not flag it were not being careless, they were being correct. Given a magnitude 7.3 on a subduction zone that produces magnitude 7s routinely, the overwhelmingly probable outcome is a normal aftershock sequence. Treating it as an ordinary main shock was the right call, according to every statistic available, and it would have been the right call in the vast majority of parallel worlds. In this one it was not. That is what a 6% probability feels like from the inside. It does not feel like a warning that was ignored. It feels like a completely ordinary Wednesday. I bring it up because it cuts against both of the easy responses to Sunday night. It cuts against dismissal, because dismissal is exactly what happened in Japan, and it was reasonable and it was wrong. And it cuts against alarm, because the correct response on March 10th still would not have been to evacuate the northeast coast of Honshu on the strength of a magnitude 7.3, and nobody in the field would argue otherwise even now with hindsight. The correct response was, and is, to watch carefully and to already be prepared. Which is an unsatisfying answer that happens to be the true one. Which is why I keep saying the mechanism rules out the megathrust but the location keeps the story alive. The mechanism is a measurement. The 6% is an admission. And there is one more reason I refuse to round that 6% down to 0, and it happened less than a month ago on the other side of this hemisphere, and it is the single most alarming thing in this entire video. Part 12, 39 seconds. On June 24th, 2026, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck Venezuela. 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5 struck the same region. The death toll from those two events exceeded 1,700 people. 39 seconds, not 39 minutes, not 39 hours, less time than it takes to read this paragraph out loud twice. In the interval between the first rupture and the second, essentially nobody had done anything. Nobody had evacuated, nobody had assessed damage. Most people had not finished processing that the first earthquake was happening before the second one started. And by the standard retrospective definition, that magnitude 7.2 was a foreshock. It became 1:39 seconds after it occurred. I bring this up not to frighten anyone, and I want to be precise about why it belongs in a video about a magnitude 5.6 off Vancouver Island. It belongs because it is the counterexample that stops the 6% from being rounded down to 0. If I only gave you the statistics, if I told you that 19 out of 20 moderate earthquakes are followed by nothing and left it there, the natural human response is to hear that as a guarantee. 94% sounds like certainty. It is not. It is a ratio, and ratios have a numerator, and the numerator is made of events like Venezuela. Somebody in Venezuela on the 24th of June was living inside the 6%. Now, I need to be careful about the comparison, because the situations are not analogous in mechanism, and I do not want to leave you with a false parallel. The Venezuela doublet was two large events on a related fault system, in close succession, in a region where the crust was clearly primed across a broad area. That is a specific and reasonably well understood phenomenon. A large rupture transfers stress to adjacent fault segments, and if those segments were already close to failure, they can fail almost immediately. 39 seconds is at the extreme fast end, but the mechanism is not mysterious. Sunday night off Vancouver Island is a different situation in almost every respect. It was a much smaller event. It was on a near-vertical fault inside a deforming oceanic microplate. The structure everyone is worried about, the Megathrust interface, is a different fault with a different geometry, and it is a fault that would need to be nudged rather than directly loaded. So I am not telling you that Vancouver Island is Venezuela. It is not. I am telling you that when I say the honest answer to "was this a foreshock" is probably not, the word probably is carrying real weight, and June 24th is why. A larger event following a large event is never impossible. It happens. It happened this year, on this continent, and it killed 1,700 people, and the interval was 39 seconds. There is a second lesson in Venezuela that connects back to what we covered earlier about Peru, and I want to draw it out because it is the practical thread running through this entire video. In neither Venezuela nor Peru was the magnitude the determining factor in how many people died. In Peru, a magnitude 5.5 killed 6 people because of adobe construction in a populated Andean valley. In Venezuela, a magnitude 7.5 killed over 1,700 because of building stock, population density, and the near-total absence of any warning interval. Both of those tolls were set by decisions made years and decades before the ground moved. The Pacific Northwest has spent those decades differently. Building codes in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon have been progressively updated for subduction zone shaking. Tsunami evacuation routes are mapped and signed along the outer coast. The Shake Alert early warning system operates across the western United States, and Canada has been building out its own earthquake early warning capability. Schools run drills. Vertical evacuation structures have been built in a few of the most exposed communities. None of that stops the earthquake. All of it changes the number at the end, and that is the honest reason to pay attention to a magnitude 5.6 on a vertical crack 200 kilometers out to sea. Not because it is dangerous. It is not, and it was not. But because it is a reminder, delivered by the ground itself at 11:41 on a Sunday night, that the most complicated segment of the most dangerous fault in North America is mechanically active right now, and that the 8 to 15 minutes everybody on the outer coast would get is a number worth having thought about in advance rather than during. Let me spend a moment on early warning specifically, because it is the one piece of technology that directly addresses the 8 to 15 minute problem, and most people do not understand what it can and cannot do. Earthquake early warning does not predict earthquakes. Nothing predicts earthquakes. What it does is exploit the fact that different seismic waves travel at different speeds. When a fault ruptures, it radiates two main types of body wave. Primary waves, or P waves, are compressional. They push and pull the rock in the direction they are travelling, like sound, and they move through crustal rock at roughly 6 kilometers per second. Secondary waves, or S waves, are shear waves. They move the rock perpendicular to their direction of travel, and they travel at roughly 3.5 kilometers per second. The S waves and the surface waves that follow them are what does the damage. The P wave arrives first, and it is comparatively gentle. That gap is the entire opportunity. A network of seismometers detects the P wave, characterizes the event in a few seconds, estimates the magnitude and location, calculates who is going to experience strong shaking, and transmits an alert electronically. Electronic signals travel at essentially the speed of light. Seismic waves travel at a few kilometers per second. The alert wins the race. How much warning you get depends entirely on how far you are from the rupture. Directly above it, essentially none, because the waves arrive before the system has finished deciding what happened. That region is called the blind zone. 100 kilometers away, perhaps 10 to 20 seconds. Several hundred kilometers away, potentially more than a minute. For a Cascadia Megathrust rupture, that geometry works unusually well for the major cities, because they are inland from the offshore fault. Seattle, Portland, Victoria, and Vancouver would plausibly receive tens of seconds of warning before strong shaking arrived. Tens of seconds is enough to stop trains, halt surgeries, open firehouse doors before the frames deform, drop elevators to the nearest floor and open them, and let people get under a table. The Shake Alert system operates across the western United States, and Canada has been building out its own national earthquake early warning capability along the same principles. But I want to be precise about the limit, because it is important. Early warning does not help the outer coast with the tsunami. If you are on the beach at Tofino or Long Beach or Cannon Beach, the alert arrives a few seconds before the shaking, and the shaking itself will last several minutes, and the water arrives 8 to 15 minutes after that. The warning system cannot buy you time you do not have. The only thing that works on the outer coast is knowing in advance that strong long shaking near the ocean means move uphill immediately without waiting for anyone to tell you to. That is the piece of preparation that costs nothing and is entirely a matter of having thought about it beforehand. Now let me close the loop on the last piece of physics, the one that a lot of people are asking about tonight, and that deserves a real answer rather than a hand wave. Can a magnitude 5.6 actually do anything to the megathrust? Can a small earthquake trigger a big one? The answer involves one of the largest numbers in this entire video. Part 13, 126,000 times. Let me start by conceding the point, because the honest version of this argument begins by admitting that the frightening idea is not stupid. Every earthquake changes the stress field around it. That is not speculation. It is a direct consequence of the fact that rock is an elastic solid. When a block of crust slips, the rock around it deforms in response, and that deformation redistributes stress across the entire surrounding volume. The redistribution is not uniform. Some regions get squeezed harder, some regions get relaxed. Seismologists calculate this with what are called Coulomb stress change models, and the output is a map of lobes, coloured red where faults have been pushed closer to failure, and blue where they have been pushed further from it. Those blue regions have a name that I love because it is so perfectly descriptive. They are called stress shadows. A fault sitting in a stress shadow has been temporarily made less likely to rupture, because the nearby earthquake unloaded it slightly. Faults in stress shadows go quiet for a while, and then, as the regional loading continues, they come back. So a single earthquake can make some of its neighbours more dangerous, and others less dangerous at the same instant, depending purely on their geometry relative to the rupture. And it does not stop with the permanent static change. There is a second effect. As seismic waves radiate outward from a rupture, they carry oscillating stresses with them, and those oscillations can perturb faults very far away momentarily. That is called dynamic triggering, and it is real, documented, and has been observed at distances of hundreds, and sometimes over 1,000 kilometres. There is also work on the San Andreas system showing that motion on subsidiary and sideways slipping strands can influence the main fault. Structures that were once treated as independent are now understood to interact, and the interaction can go in the direction of pushing the larger fault closer to failure. A domino arrangement in effect, among faults that a map would show as separate objects. So, does an earthquake change the stress on nearby faults? Yes. Can that change push a fault toward failure? Yes. Can it happen at a distance? Yes, to a degree. I have now given the frightening idea every advantage. Here is where it collapses. A magnitude 9 earthquake releases approximately 126,000 times more energy than a magnitude 5.6. Sit with that number for a second, because I think it is the single most clarifying fact in this entire subject, and almost nobody has an intuition for it. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, which people know, but the way it is usually explained undersells it badly. Each whole step up in magnitude is roughly 32 times more energy released. Not double, not 10 times, 32. So going from 5.6 to 9 is not a few steps up the ladder. It is 32 times 32 times 32 and change. If a magnitude 5.6 were a single stick of dynamite, a magnitude 9 would be more than 100,000 of them, going off across an area the size of a small country. Now think about what that means for the stress budget. The Cascadia Megathrust has accumulated something like 13 metres of slip deficit over 326 years across a locked interface hundreds of kilometres long and tens of kilometres wide. That deficit was built by 4 centimetres a year of relentless plate convergence, every year, without pause, for more than 3 centuries. It represents an amount of stored elastic strain that is difficult to write down in a way that means anything. Against that, the permanent stress change from Sunday night's rupture is concentrated near a rupture surface measured in single-digit kilometres. Coulomb stress changes fall off sharply with distance, becoming negligible beyond roughly 1 to 2 fault lengths from the source. For a magnitude 5.6, that is a zone of influence measured in a handful of kilometres, not the hundreds of kilometres the locked zone spans. The stress budget of a magnitude 9 is not built out of magnitude 5.6s. It is built out of 3 centuries of plate convergence. One moderate earthquake on a vertical fault in the oceanic plate does not load the megathrust in any meaningful sense. It cannot. The scales are not comparable. So here is my honest, complete answer to the trigger question. Could Sunday night's earthquake contribute a fractional nudge to a fault segment that was already sitting right at its failure threshold? In principle, in the strictest physical sense, yes. That is what the physics permits, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make the answer cleaner. Is there any evidence that it did? No. Is a magnitude 5.6 capable of loading the Cascadia Megathrust? No. Not remotely. Not by orders of magnitude. And if the Megathrust does rupture next week, next year, or next decade, will it have been because of Sunday night? Almost certainly not. It will have been because of 326 years of 4 centimeters a year, which was always going to be the answer, and which would have been the answer whether or not a vertical crack in the Explorer plate let go on a Sunday. Which finally lets me answer the question I asked at the very beginning of this video, the one about why the title says what it says. The title does not say this was a foreshock, it says it is not a good sign. And I chose that phrasing carefully, because the case for it does not rest on the trigger physics at all. It rests on 3 other things, and now that you have the full picture, you can judge them for yourself. The first is that the most structurally complicated segment of Cascadia is mechanically active right now, not dormant, not quiet, producing moderate earthquakes on steep internal faults, which is exactly what a plate being torn apart should do, and exactly what the new imaging predicts. The second is the 6%, a roughly 1 in 20 window in which the truthful statement is that we cannot rule it out yet. And the third is the one I find most compelling. This earthquake landed in the precise segment that researchers have just finished recharacterizing as fragmenting. Our model of how that segment behaves is being rewritten right now. Events like Sunday night are the data doing the rewriting, and when your model of the most dangerous fault in North America is actively under revision, an unexpected data point from the middle of the revision zone is not a comfortable thing. None of that is a prediction. All of it is a reason to be watching rather than dismissing. So let me hand you the specific thing to watch, because I have spent this entire video telling you what we cannot know, and I owe you the one thing we actually can. Part 14. Which way the aftershocks go. Here is the criterion. It is simple enough to explain in a sentence, and it is the thing seismologists will actually be watching over the next several days. Watch which direction the aftershocks move. That is it. Not the count, not the magnitude of the largest one, the direction. Let me explain why that specific measurement carries so much information, because once you understand it, you will be able to read the next week of this sequence yourself without waiting for anyone to interpret it for you. Aftershocks are the surrounding rock adjusting to a change. When a fault slips, the stress redistribution we talked about pushes some nearby patches of rock past their failure threshold, and they break, and that breaking redistributes stress again, and so it cascades outward and decays over time. The spatial pattern of where those aftershocks occur is a direct map of where the stress went. So if Sunday night's earthquake was what the mechanism says it was, an internal fracture inside the deforming Explorer plate releasing accumulated internal stress, then the aftershocks should stay put. They should cluster around the main shock out there in the oceanic plate west of the subduction front. They should decay according to the ordinary pattern, dropping off roughly as one over elapsed time, with the largest one landing somewhere around a magnitude in the mid-4s. In the 2014 sequence, the largest aftershock came 13 minutes after the main shock and sat about 20 kilometers away. Something in that shape would be entirely unremarkable. That is the boring outcome, and it is by far the most likely one. Now the other pattern. If aftershock activity migrates eastward, toward the subduction front and the locked interface beneath Vancouver Island, that is a different signal entirely. Eastward migration would mean the stress release Sunday night is not dissipating locally in the oceanic plate. It would mean it is being redistributed into the direction of the locked zone, and that rock closer to the Megathrust interface is responding. That is the pattern that would justify raising an eyebrow, and it is the pattern that would get discussed in agency statements rather than only in papers. I want to stress that even eastward migration would not mean a Megathrust rupture is imminent. It would mean the story is more interesting than we currently think it is, and that the stress interaction between the fragmenting Explorer plate and the locked interface deserves more attention than a footnote. It would be a reason to keep watching, not a reason to panic, but it is checkable. Anyone can check it. The USGS and Earthquakes Canada event catalogues are public. They update continuously, and you can look at the map yourself over the coming days and see whether the dots stay clustered or start marching east. You do not need me for that, and you do not need to trust anyone's interpretation. The data is right there. That is what I mean when I say the useful response to an event like this is attention rather than fear. Fear does not have a next step. Attention has a specific one, and this is it. There are 2 other threads I'm going to be following, and I will tell you what they are so you know what I am watching for. The first is whether a refined solution ties this earthquake to a mapped structure. Right now, the epicenter plots west of the main Nootka fault zone, and the beach ball gives us 2 possible fault planes with no way to choose between them. Over the coming weeks, as more station data is incorporated and relocated catalogues are produced, it may become possible to say whether this ruptured a known conjugate strand, or whether it revealed something that is not on any map. Remember that the 2014 sequence found a 40-kilometre fault nobody knew about. There is no particular reason to assume we have found all of them. The second is what the hazard modelers do with the tiers. The Cascadia Region Earthquake Science Centre is incorporating the newly imaged structures into its models right now, and the question they are working on is the one we posed earlier and could not answer. Do those detached and fragmented sections act as barriers that stop a rupture propagating north, or do they act as boundaries where a rupture initiates? That answer has not been published. When it is, it will materially change how the northern Cascadia hazard is stated, and it will change it in one direction or the other, rather than splitting the difference. It is one of the few genuinely consequential open questions in North American earthquake science that is likely to be resolved in the next several years, rather than the next several decades. So let me bring this back to where we started, at 11:41 on a Sunday night, with an alarm going off in the dark. What actually happened is almost certainly this. The Explorer plate is being dragged downward beneath North America while it is simultaneously being pushed and sheared sideways by the Juan de Fuca and Pacific plates surrounding it. Different sections move at different speeds in different directions. The plate cannot stay whole under those conditions, so it deforms internally, bending and rotating and shearing. And on Sunday night, one of its steep internal fractures accumulated more stress than it could hold, and it failed, and the ocean floor 208 kilometres southwest of Port McNeill moved sideways by some small amount. That is not the beginning of the big one. The mechanism is wrong, the geometry is wrong, the scale is wrong, and the energy is wrong by a factor of 126,000. But it is the sound of the northern end of the Cascadia subduction zone coming apart. Not tonight, not this decade, not on any timescale that touches a human life, but continuously and measurably and in a way we can now photograph with sound. And that leaves me with the thing I actually cannot stop turning over. We can image this region in enough detail to watch it fragment. We can measure a 5-kilometre offset in a slab buried beneath the seafloor. We can identify which sections of a 75-kilometre tear are still grinding and which have gone silent because they have already let go. We can project the whole process forward 1,000,000 years and tell you how much shorter Cascadia will be when it is finished. What we cannot do is tell you what all that broken rock will do to a rupture that starts tomorrow. It might be a wall. The fragmentation might be the thing that stops a magnitude 9 from running the full length of the margin, and in that case the most broken part of the fault is the part that saves the most lives. Or it might be the floor where the whole thing begins. We do not know which, and until we do, every time the ground moves in that particular stretch of ocean, the only honest thing anyone can say is that we just received one more piece of information about a question nobody has answered. So here is the one I will leave you with, and it is the question I will be checking the catalogues for every morning this week. Over the next several days, do those aftershocks stay out there in the oceanic plate where they belong, or do they start moving east?